Hello, I am Mother Creepypasta, and welcome to episode 3 of After the Trial. Here, I will be telling you about horror stories come to life, about the people who were involved, and where they are now, after the trial. In this episode, we will be speaking about one of America's most notorious gangsters, Al Capone, his rise to power, his fall, and eventually, his madness. Born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, Alphonse Capone was the fourth of 9 children. His parents, immigrants from Italy, Gabriel and Teresa Capone. Al belonged to a street gang when he was younger, and eventually dropped out of school in the 6th grade. Later he would join the 5 Points gang and become a bouncer at the Harvard Inn on Coney Island, owned by notorious mobster Frankie Yale. Al Capone would go on to wed May Colin. These two stayed together until his death and had one child named Sonny. In 1917, Capone's face was slashed in a fight at the Harvard Inn after he insulted a female patron, and her brother retaliated. This would give Al Capone 3 scars on his face that would aid to his nickname of Scarface later on in his life. He would usually attempt to shield that side of his face or use makeup to camouflage them and claim them to be scars from the war, though he never served. Al Capone hated the term Scarface, and his associates often called him Big Fellow or Snorky, which is a slang term for spiffy. It was in 1920 Capone moved to Chicago working under Torrio, who was part of a criminal network headed by a man named Big Jim Colosimo. Colosimo died shortly after and Torrio took over, making Capone one of his key aides. In January of 1925, though, Torrio was gunned down outside his home in Illinois. He survived the attack but left Chicago later that year, leaving Capone in charge. He expanded his crew, and they are estimated to have pulled in $100 million a year off bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and racketeering. Adjusted for inflation, that equals out to around $1.4 billion today. Then, on February 14th, 1929, America was shook to its core as 7 men associated with a rival gang were lined up in a parking garage and shot to death. There were supposedly 4 men who committed the acts, 2 of which were dressed as police officers. It would be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It became widely rumored that the hit had been masterminded by Al Capone, but it occurred while he was away in Florida, and the case remains unsolved to this day. It was not bootlegging, murder, or any other mob-related activities that eventually got Capone thrown behind bars. Instead, in May 1929, Capone was picked up in Philadelphia on his way back from a supposed meeting in Atlantic City of organized crime heads for carrying a concealed weapon. He was swiftly sentenced to a year in jail. He would be released in March 1930. A month later, the Chicago Crime Commission released its first ever list of the city's criminals, with Al Capone as public enemy number 1. It would be just over a year later, in June 1931, that the federal government would complete their case against Capone on income tax fraud and convict him of tax evasion. Capone would be given a plea deal with a recommended prison sentence of 2.5 years. The judge, however, would not accept this, and Capone removed his guilty plea as the case went to trial. The judge quickly learned that much of the jury had been bought off in favor of Capone and changed many of the jurors outright before the trial. In October of 1931, Capone would be found guilty of 5 of the 20 counts against him. He was sentenced to 11 years and received a $50,000 fine, equal to about $800,000 today. If Al Capone were alive now, he would be 118 years old. Instead, he survived another 16 years upon his release. He started his sentence in May 1932 and spent 2 years in jail before he was sent to the newly opened Alcatraz Penitentiary. While still being held in Atlanta, Capone had been diagnosed with syphilis and started to show signs of advanced stages, including dementia. As he worsened, the prison doctors of Alcatraz began treating him with malaria injections in hope that the fevers caused by the disease would get rid of the syphilis. This almost killed Capone, and in 1939, he was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island near Los Angeles to serve his 1-year misdemeanor. Capone was released from prison in November 1939, having served 7 of his 11-year sentence. He went under many treatments for syphilis in Baltimore, to no avail. Capone's syphilis became unpredictable. At times he seemed normal. Other times his speech would slur, or he would become disoriented and he would suffer from tremors and seizures. Capone lacked mental and physical coordination, and he would often switch subjects abruptly. He would often hum, whistle, and sing as he chatted about nothing. Capone was one of the first patients to receive penicillin as a treatment for syphilis. His condition would stabilize thanks to the treatment, but there had already been extensive damage to his brain and could not be reversed. In 1946, a Baltimore psychiatrist performed examinations on Capone and concluded that he had the mentality of a 12-year-old. In January of 1947, Capone suffered a stroke due to a brain hemorrhage. The newspapers began to gather and report Capone's death, but he actually survived for another week until he developed bronchial pneumonia, an advanced symptom of syphilis, and died on January 25, 1947. He was buried next to his father and brother, but in 1952, when his mother died, his body was moved to lay beside her. It always seems that the bad a person does outweighs the good. Many don't know that Al Capone started one of America's first soup kitchens and held a record of 120,000 served in one day. This, and knowing the shady side of the man, raised suspicion, and even the charitable act is looked at with suspicious eyes at what he may have been using the soup kitchen for behind the scenes. Another side project of Capone's was the milk industry. When a family member got sick from drinking expired milk, Capone had an idea. He bought a milk processor, Meadowmore Dairies, and then had the Chicago City Council pass a law requiring a visible date stamped on milk containers. It is also reported that Capone would give milk to schools with small or no budgets to afford any, so the kids wouldn't go without. Again, many doubt the sincerity and believe he did it merely for the publicity. What do you think? Do you think Al Capone only started a soup kitchen and made milk distributors place an expiration date and gave free milk to schools who couldn't afford any, only as a ploy to keep the people of Chicago loving him? Or do you think he genuinely cared about the well-being of his fellow men and the younger generation after him? Leave me a comment with what you think.